Well, good afternoon, National Museum of American History and Smithsonian colleagues, and welcome to the Smithsonian Staff Learning Series hosted by the National Museum of American History. The series aims to explore the latest in audience research, trends, and activity so we can apply these insights to our audience-based work. My name is Adam Roseanne, and I'll be your host and moderator for today's talk, in which we are joined by Stacie de Armas, the Senior Vice President of Diverse Intelligence and Initiatives at Nielsen, who will share new insights on media usage and representation from Hispanic audiences. Please note that today's discussion is being recorded with closed caption, and I'll be helping our speaker by moderating the chat. So please do add your questions to the chat. Also, mark your calendars for this Thursday, October 12th at 2 p.m. Also on Zoom for another Smithsonian Staff Learning Series, when we'll be hosting and speaking with Roy L. Austin Jr. from Facebook's Meta. Roy is the VP of Civil Rights and Deputy General Counsel. He will discuss the intersection of civil rights and technology. That is going to be great. And lastly, I'd like to hear from you. So please take a moment today or tomorrow and share your thoughts on the series, past speakers, and your ideas for the future with me. Thank you very much. And with that, please join me in welcoming Stacie to the Smithsonian Staff Learning Series stage. Stacie, is an honor to have you here today, and we're just all looking forward to your talk.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Adam. Welcome, everyone, those watching live and those that are watching this after the recording. My name is Stacie de Armas. I am a Latina. I am first generation Cuban here in the United States. I have 2 children, and well, what more can I tell you about me? It's been my privilege and my pleasure to work advocating for the U.S. Latino community in every step along my career. I've had the privilege of doing that through media and measurement and audience attributes. So we'll talk a little bit about how the community, advocacy, and the media entertainment industry all intersect, and how it can perhaps influence and or inform some of the work that you're doing. Really quickly, most of you, if you've heard of Nielsen or if you participated in a previous learning series, you'll know that Nielsen is probably best known for our media or audience measurements. When people talk about how many people watch the Super Bowl or the Grammys or any given piece of content, there's usually that number that's produced comes from Nielsen, as well as sort of a television ranking, like what's the most watched show or the top 10 shows on television. That's Nielsen data that produces that. We also do a lot of social and economic research on the side, and that's the pillar that I sit in. I have a colleague joining me today from within that same pillar. And so we use our access to data and information to create narratives to empower the community as well. So we have information, of course, on who's watching what, but also on the people that are watching content, and we're able to deconstruct sort of the evolution of communities over time as it relates to content and just access to information. So I'll be sharing with you a little bit on that journey today. As Adam mentioned, it is Hispanic Heritage Month. And so each year we mark throughout different points in the year, Nielsen does, different parts of the year where we bring forward information on specific communities. Sometimes it is within the Heritage or an Affinity Month, and sometimes it is at other points throughout the year. This year on September 12th, we launched our Nielsen Hispanic, what we call our Hispanic Diverse Intelligence Series report. We do it around this time every year, and it focuses on the U.S. Hispanic audience and also the U.S. Hispanic community, and again, how those two interface. I placed a QR code in the upper right-hand corner. You feel free to snap an image that'll take you to directly where you can see the report. The idea today, however, is not to go over every page of that report, but to bring forward some of the high-level themes that are covered in the report that I felt would be of most interest to you and the work that you do. For additional depth on any of those topics, please feel free to reference the report or send me a link. I have a note at the bottom. I have at Stacie de Armas. You'll see that next to October 23rd. That's pretty much where you can find me across social handles, easy to find on LinkedIn. So if there's a subsequent question, or if you're curious if we do reports like these for, say, Native American or Indigenous peoples in the US, you can ask me and I'll tell you we do, and I'll send you that information. So without further ado, we'll get started and we'll cover off on some of the basics. Before I advance the slide, though, I have designed this talk or this overview to really be just that. There are parts in the report where we go into great depth on what's happening within the community as it relates to media, entertainment, visibility, And I'll talk a little bit about that here too, but this is also designed to be an informative report for people that work throughout your organization. So whether they interface or not directly with the US Hispanic community, there's still value. So for some folks that have been walking this walk with us for many years, some of the beginning data as we set the stage may feel like data that you already know. That's okay. That's also designed to bring everyone in. And as Adam suggested, feel free to ask questions along the way. I'm happy to address them and to go into more detail. So let's get started. First of all, the power of the community has been growing year after year. I've been working on these reports and bringing forward this data and information for about 10 years. And obviously, I've seen these numbers evolve throughout the course of that time. You know that today, US Latinos represent about 19% of the population. That data is easily Googleable, and you can see, sort of where the majority of the growth is coming, which is actually increasingly US-born Latinos. Hispanics today in the US number about 58% are under the age of 34, and that's that second data point, that kind of giving more a better description to who this 19% of the population is. That actually may not seem like a huge percentage, but to have nearly 60% of the population be under the age of 34 and the huge chunk, the majority being under the age of 18, really gives you perspective as to how the community is shifting so quickly. For example, if anyone has looked at the top 10 lately on Spotify or any of the charts, you'll notice that Mexican Regional has had this huge point of visibility on the charts with Peso Pluma and Karol G, who's actually reggaetonera, and others really taking up those top spots. And what's interesting, again, is you're looking at 19% of the population. How are we able to influence more than 60% of the charts? And the answer is in that third data point there, that the vast majority of our population is younger. So it's not only influencing our whole cohort of Latinos, but also, dominating younger populations within classrooms, friendship groups, colleges and universities, et cetera. And that's having this really cool influence on overall American trends. That second point is part of this as well, which is 34% identifying as two or more races, which is up more than 600% since 2010. People often ask us, is that because in 2010 census, you couldn't identify maybe as more than one race, which is why we see this? No, the answer to that is that's not why. In fact, you could answer to the more than one race question for a number of years. I think we dated it back to 1990. But what has changed is a more complex understanding that Americans have around historical context, and in particular as it relates to race, ethnicity, and belonging in the U.S. So as that becomes more complex and there is a better understanding of historical narratives around, the founding of the country and our original populations, what we have seen is people are increasingly really wanting to identify with their roots that are beyond simple race and ethnicity, which is taking us to people identifying as more than two races. I'll go into this a little bit on the next slide, but I just wanted to give you a primer for that, because this is actually really interesting. And it's not often that we see an increase of more than 600% in something like a personal identity over a decade, unless something significant has happened. One, the change of a question, which I mentioned we didn't have, or two, a change of popular culture and how we think about identity. The Latino community is particularly impacted by this because generally Latinidad is an ethnicity. It is not a race. And so what we're finding is Latinos are identifying more as other, or perhaps with their indigenous roots, especially if they have history from Mexico. So I gave you a lot there, but I think that's interesting, and it will help us contextualize some of the other changes we're seeing in the country, and also the need for the consumption of diverse content and the appetite for more visibility on screen. And then that last point is purchasing power. So there are two figures. If you're following at all the Latino narrative this Hispanic Heritage Month, there are two figures that are often tossed around. One is buying power, and the other, or buying or purchasing power, and the other is Latino GDP. The Latino GDP and the Latino purchasing power are both produced from Latino Donor Collaborative, and they try and frame the power of Hispanics within the U.S. versus Latino buying power, which is a different figure that's produced by Selig Center for Economic Growth. Here, in this presentation, we're going to talk about Latino purchasing power because it is a newer figure that just came out, I think, 2 weeks ago by Latino Donor Collaborative. Within the report, which was produced just before, we use the Selig Center data and data from LDC, Latino Donor Collaborative, from last year. So please refer to both of those resources. They're amazing. And Adam, just as a nod, perhaps Ana Valdez from Latino Donor Collaborative would be also a great speaker to have in future months. So let's move on. All right, so the population break. I discussed that we're about 19% of the population. Interestingly, though, as I mentioned earlier, we are seeing more diversification of the population. So we often talk about Latinos and Latinidad and in the past, and certainly in the past 4 years, for sure 3, but even more than that, there has been an increased focus on the diversity within our community and our intersectional identities. So here we aim to just identify within our 62 million the percentage of the population that is Afro-Latino, Latino Asian, often called Chino Latino. And of course, interestingly enough, as we discussed, this huge portion of the population that are identifying as belonging to more than one race. So let's talk about it. This is what I affectionately call my eye breaker chart, because it's so fun to look at. For those that are consuming this without visuals, I'll try and walk you through it. What we've attempted to compare here is year to year, the percent change in that over 600% that I mentioned of people identifying as more than one race. And I need to move our imagery a little bit, Adam, so that I can see. There we go, my own chart to read. So as you can see, 2 or more races is up 629% between the 2 years. And if you look at white alone, people identifying as white alone, that's down 58%. So as a Cubana, I have always identified as, for my race, as white, and then my ethnicity as Latina, or in census, I can select Cuban. But the other races, I have not identified. I am not Asian, nor am I Black, and so I have identified as white. What this has created, though, is a more, as I mentioned earlier, complex cultural conversation around whiteness and Latinidad, and perhaps some of our more indigenous roots. And so this is why what we think is driving this white alone reduction and this increase of 2 or more races, in addition to the fact that Latinos, more than any other group, have more blended marriages, have more experiences across different races and cultures. And so this is really interesting, I think, and I hope you'll find that too. And it also influences what we're seeing as popular content and how Latinos are identifying with content. So we'll talk more about that as we move on. All right, a couple of other high-level things about the community that I'm going to bring to you, and then we're going to dive deep into the media and entertainment component, also truth and trust in news, and how Latinos see themselves as part of the American landscape, which we know will be interesting to and inform some of your work. Really quickly, one of the things that we've been talking a lot about, and we think brands and advertisers are particularly interested in, is this idea of the differences in how Latinos experience their life cycle. So this is sort of a crude map. This isn't a crude image. It's not technical, but it explains the idea very well that we outline with the difference in life cycle expenditures or life cycle milestones in any given lifetime. So the yellow represents non-Hispanic white, and sort of where some of these major milestones or experiences occur. So things like graduating college, buying a first home, having children, etc. Right? They really happen in somewhat a very narrow band. And you can imagine as a marketer why this is very interesting. So this is where some of our more traditional demographics have been born from the traditional, white non-Hispanic sort of life cycle, milestone life cycles. For Latinos, that's flattened out, but to the benefit of our community. It doesn't mean that there's any less. It means that it's spread differently. So you have things like first home purchases, the acquisition of, secondary education, children, all happening at different points within a life versus happening sort of within this thin band of, 35 to 54, let's say, which what we see with non-Hispanic white. When I talk with brands and advertisers about this, the idea here is the opportunity it brings to build a relationship with this consumer for much longer. So let me explain that here. I'm going to skip to here to explain it. What you end up happening is a lot more opportunity to build loyalty. You have a traditional life expectancy for Hispanics at around 78, non-Hispanic white is at 76. So by the way, I should mention this life expectancy was reduced pretty significantly, as many of you had read about post-COVID, most of it related to that. But the difference here is the median age. You have a non-Hispanic white median age around 44, Latino median age around 30. So that gives you this longer opportunity for expenditures and, frankly, to build a relationship with and nurture a relationship with the Latino community. We think this is really interesting. And again, not just for someone advertising a product or someone in retail, but even for the work that you're doing and thinking about how you're relating to a community and what your opportunity is to ensure that they're, present and part of the work that you're doing for a very long time. Let's see. So a few other stats before we move into, again, like the media and entertainment component. We talked about 58% being under the age of 34 versus 39% for your non-Hispanic white. So there's sort of your juxtaposition and the opportunity. But we talked about intersectional identity as it came around race and ethnicity, but we didn't talk about it as LGBTQ+. You have 11% of the community identifying as within the community. 11% of Hispanic community identifying as being within the LGBTQ+ community versus about 6% for non-Hispanic whites. Part of that is due to age again. Remember, we talked about the scales being largely tipped to younger Latinos, who younger people in general are much more fluid around their identity and belonging, whereas you have non-Hispanic white population that is dominated in older ages that perhaps have, less contemporary views of what belonging looks like. So this also, I think, is important and could and should inform some of the work that you're doing. A few other stats that I find very interesting, so I'm sharing them with you today. We often talk about the labor force, and we talk about the Latino contribution to the labor force. 91% of U.S. labor force growth between 2010 and 2020 was Hispanic. So of all of the labor force growth that occurred, more than 90% of it came from within our community. Over the next 10 years, that's expected to be about 78%. So it's not necessarily decline. It's just reflective of the young community coming in and being a larger part of that growth. And then the community already being within. So the new, as people are having less babies, you're going to have less of that new growth coming in, but still, more than 3/4 coming from the Latino community. So it's pretty clear that the future of America's labor force is Hispanic. I skipped past a couple of slides, but Adam, I'll share them with you, of course, for afterward. And one of the things that I thought was important to point out is, and I'll say it here and you'll have the slide afterward, is that labor force participation among people age 16 and older, for the total US, it's 63%. For Latinos, it's 68%. In fact, it's the highest of any diverse group, non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic Black, or Asian, at ages 16 and over. When you look at 18 and over, it's about the same. But the reason I bring this forward is it tells us that Latinos are also working younger. So they're entering the workforce younger, which also influences that curve I shared at where different milestones occur. When you enter the workforce sooner, you have things like financial independence coming sooner. You have living situations changing sooner because you have income coming in sooner. So I thought that's an interesting point that sort of ties to this labor force conversation. All right, and last set of stats before we move to talking about cultural identity and influence of media. 20% of college students today are Hispanic. You have 100% growth in college enrollment will come from Hispanics over the next 8 years. And again, we talked about that labor force, 78% over the next 10, the last 10, 91%. And of course, the biggest influencers. So this has been a shift from year to year. We've talked a lot about language being a really important marker for Latino identity, and it is. But increasingly, as Latinos are US born and spending time here in the US, language has become more of a utility and an opportunity rather than a necessity, if that makes sense. So I think about my family. Everyone is fluent in Spanish, some more than others, but everyone is also fluent to some degree in English. So it's not a necessity that we need to consume content in any given language, nor is it a necessity that, or nor is it the sentiment that language is our identifier. Is one of many. And one thing we saw change in this work is that it used to be culture and language and food always ranking very high. And the last time we just pulled this research forward, we saw that food is in fact ranking very high along with language and culture. Culture and music. And I think that's really important, especially in the context of how we're seeing Latinos show up in media and entertainment and in music, which we just discussed, really that being an identifier. Importantly, what we thought was going to happen is actually a bit of the reverse. That is to say, Latino culture seems to not only be influencing American culture, right? You have this 19% of the population influencing something like the charts globally and in the US for music for the whole population, but you have other identity groups wanting to lean in and consume Latino content and culture in a way that we didn't exactly expect. I think the expectation was there would always be influence, but not that there would be the drive and the for lack of maybe a better term, sort of the social status and the coolness of being identified within the community through your knowledge of food or culture or content. And that's a really cool sort of reversal that we're seeing in general. It's pretty evident in social platforms like TikTok, et cetera. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what we're seeing in media and entertainment and how I think that influences the American psyche around who Latinos are and our contribution to the country. So that is to say, we can identify all of these points about our contribution to the population, to the economy, to, we skipped past purchasing and buying power, which are both at about, over 3 trillion. But we also have to recognize that as much as we are changing and shaping our experience here in the US, a lot of it is actually formed by how media perceives who we are, and that's done based on how we're our relationship with content. So first, how much time are Latinos spending with content? Well, we have about 61 billion minutes of viewing power every week. So there is a lot of eyeballs spent with media and entertainment, a lot of eyeball time. This, of course, presents an opportunity for brands and advertisers who want to ensure that they have a good relationship with the Latino community. But this number is up 51 billion from just last year. And it really, I think, speaks about this dynamic and influential role Latinos play in what's popular and what's trending. A significant amount of time spent with media and a significant amount of time actually spent with video or visual programming. Music always, again, doing very well. We'll talk about that in just a second. But there's a lot of power here. And viewing choices of Latinos are shifting or are translating into cultural shifts that we're seeing across content. This is a quick overview of where some of that time is spent across television, mobile app, web, video. What we have seen happening isn't actually a huge movement of time from one medium to another, but rather this distribution and co-consumption. So like many of you, Latinos will watch TV and be on their phone, so you have social plus you have television. There might be music and social. And so the good news is there isn't necessarily a degradation from any of these vehicles. There's actually this proliferation and utility of multiple vehicles. But let's zero in on television because that's where representation really happens. That's where we see ourselves in content, and that's how others perceive who we are. So quickly, where are Latinos spending their time when they spend it with TV? I think we all know from personal experience that everyone is spending more time streaming. Nielsen has been reporting on this for the better part of a year. Around summer last year, the streaming, what we call the tipping point, happened for all populations. So, more than 33% of time spent with television was spent with streaming. So you had this distribution of 30 or so percent with cable, 30 or so percent with broadcast, and then 33.5% with streaming, telling us that America was finally streaming more than more than broadcast or cable consumption. That might be surprising to you. You might say, I do all of my time spent with streaming. And then I would say to you, you're mirroring what we're seeing for the Latino community. Latinos actually, today, the population spends total American viewing to television spends about 38% of their time with streaming. Latinos spend 51% of their time with streaming. So far surpassing time with streaming than what we see with America. And in fact, the second highest is Asian Americans at about 46%. And et cetera under, right? Time spent with streaming. So this is actually really significant because it is, more than 15 percentage points higher than what we see. Well, about 15 percentage points, 13 than what we see with the total market. But it begs the question, why? And because this is a holistic view, this one we do have viewing coming from somewhere else to move itself to streaming. But the question to answer is why? Why would Latinos be spending so much more time streaming than anybody else? Because for the most part, you would imagine you have age, right? That's a factor. We talked about the fact that the community is younger. Certainly that's an influence. Younger people perhaps are finding more relevant content on streaming platforms, or more willing, more savvy with the technology. But it's still such a huge difference. We have to question why that is. What is it about either the content or the platforms that are drawing Latinos in a way that we don't see replicated in any other identity group? And I would love to hear what some of you think, why that is. We'll talk about it, but I'm interested to know what your gut reaction is. This is where we see the distribution of viewing go, though. We have about 16% going to YouTube, 13% to Netflix, and then of course there's a bunch of other streaming services listed beneath. Netflix is pretty popular. Everyone watches Netflix. But YouTube is fascinating, and it's among the highest. And this is sort of the same question. So if we know that more viewing is going to streaming, and we know of that distribution, more of it's going to YouTube than any other group. Nobody has numbers like this on the board. What is it about YouTube? And then, of course, that takes us to the topic we're going to center on in just a few slides, which is authenticity of content. One thing that you find in YouTube is you find, at least I think of my family, my grandparents, and my aunts, there's a lot of relevant older content that now we all have accessible, we can access, right? Easily accessible. Whereas even 10 years ago, you couldn't watch specific programming or find specific content that would meet perhaps a cultural need or a learning desire. It was much more difficult. Today, all that content is accessible. But you also have, YouTube is a creator-driven platform. So you're having content that brings that nuance, that the cultural nods, and all the components that are sometimes missing in broadcasting cable television, with the exception of Spanish language television, which does a remarkable job. And in fact, within the report, not on this slide or in this deck, because we just didn't have time to go through it all, but within the report, we break that down a little bit. Here you'll see for all Latinos, you have about 18.8% dedicated to broadcast, 16.2% to cable. And this is for all Hispanics. When we look at Spanish language dominant Hispanics, that number is 10 percentage points higher for broadcast. So you maintain this really robust streaming number. I think it's around 49% for Spanish language dominant Latinos. But broadcast is now 28%. So most of the loss of viewing in that case is coming from cable and other. And we probably know why for Spanish language dominant Hispanics, broadcast television has such a stronghold where we don't see it anywhere else across the television landscape. And that's because of the relationship that our Spanish language broadcast partners have with the community. It's authentic, it is meaningful, it is based in long-term mutual accountability, right? If you or anyone watches Spanish language television, they will tell you Spanish language television has recognized that they have a responsibility to the community to inform and to educate in a way that we don't necessarily see replicated in English language media. So that's definitely reflective of this particular chart when you look at it for Spanish language dominant Hispanics. So let's talk about sentiment and how Latinos feel around content. Latinos enjoy inclusive content, right? We want to see ourselves reflected within content, and we want to see ourselves reflected meaningfully within content. 53% say they're more likely to continue watching content when it features someone from their identity group. That's actually down from 2021, and we can talk about why that is. It has to do with perhaps more things just being thrown in that aren't necessarily absolutely authentic. So in 2021, that number was 56%. We've seen that decline, which tells us that it's not just about volume, right? It's not quantity, it's about quality. And I think you can take this also and think about the work that you're doing, right? Whether you're curating or you're building, narratives for the community, it's not just about forcing an inclusion narrative, but ensuring it's the right narrative, with more than half of Latinos saying if it's important for them to watch content that features them, it's important for them to be within your practices, your facilities, your narrative, and see themselves reflected in the same way. You have 89% seeking out content in a preferred language. This is a little tricky. That doesn't mean the preferred language is Spanish. It means that content is superior over the language that it's delivered in. So I skipped past the slide prior, but I'll leave it for you to have a look at. Unlike our non-Hispanic white counterparts, where more than 74% said, I need content in my language, right? Like I have to have it in English, essentially. That's where I'm going to watch content. That doesn't mean we're not going to watch subtitled content. It means that's preferred. Latinos, it was split evenly between English and Spanish as preferred, meaning I'll kind of take it in either language. So the quality of the content is preferred over the language of delivery. And 49% saying that they want to engage with brands that advertise within inclusive content. So again, taking this from the advertiser and brand playbook, they want to have a relationship with brands who they feel like have an authentic and meaningful relationship with them. Here's that 72% that I referred to before. And then, of course, some new data lately that we've just pushed out, I think, at the beginning of September on radio formats and on music. Of course, the top two formats in the country, Mexican regional and Spanish contemporary. Evident on the chart's very easy to see. We've talked a little bit about that. One of the cool things about that, I think, and what has driven the consumption of Spanish language music is the lack of barrier that is needed for enjoyment of that particular piece of media. So I think of when my son moved into college last summer and Bad Bunny, it's still super popular, but at that time, just over the moon, and how I would hear the kids in the call, trying to mouth whatever they could to, Titi me pregunto, and just on with the, and then you'd hear a random like, novia, selfie, say cheese, like just these, and what it's curious and it's fun, but what it really tells me is that language isn't a barrier for enjoying Latino culture when it comes to music. And as a result of that, you have younger populations from outside of the Latino community serving to push that content up in popularity. The same thing I think we're going to be seeing more of in television. Adam, I'm going to pause for a minute. Is there anything in the chat I should address, because I can't necessarily see it before I move on?
You just keep going. This data is great. Just keep going.
Okay,
no
great.
Questions yet.
Everyone's enjoying it. Okay, great. So we're going to talk about media and entertainment today, and this is the area next, rather, not today. This is the area that I think you can probably pull some insights from to inform your work, or perhaps just find it interesting. So media and what we watch on television is more than just passive consumption. So this is a little bit of the social science part of the presentation. These are tools that reflect and shape our cultural identity and our belonging here in the country. So for Hispanics, media acts as a mirror, reflecting the diversity and the shifts within the community. I mentioned earlier about that 11% that are now identifying as being within the LGBTQ plus community. That is serving not only as not a reflection of, the younger portion of the community, but the adoption of this more contemporary thinking about belonging by older generations of Latino are coming along. And there is a lot of, we know that there is, a strong history around faith, and perhaps a difficulty around for older populations in being more fluid about evolving identities. But we also know that with the younger population being so much larger, our abuelitas are coming around. They are coming around, and it's a testament to the strength of not only our younger population, but also how they're shaping and shifting how we show up on television. So I want to talk in this next slide sort of media as a mirror, and how the reflection of diversity on television impacts both how we see ourselves and how others see the capability of Latinos in the US. This is really important because we hear a lot about representation and and stereotypical content, and whether that's good or bad or right or wrong. I think what we have failed to do enough of is contextualizing what that means for our community. Last Thursday was Latina Equal Pay Day, and someone asked me a question about, because it is a holistic number around all of Latinas' earnings compared to all of non-Hispanic white women's earnings. And this person who was challenging this asked me, well, is it because Latinas, what career paths are Latinas choosing that are, is that impacting it? And of course, I started typing out my entire response to that, essentially saying, it is a much more complex issue than what career paths Latinos are choosing. It has to do with what we believe we can be and the potential we believe we can have and our families believe we have. And a lot of that is, is under the surface of how we are presented within content. So let's talk a little bit about that. First of all, the content that we end up seeing is largely driven by recommendations from family and friends. So people will tell us to watch something, and that is, 69% saying, hey, that's how I find the shows that I want to see. More than 50% saying that the media that they watch brings them, or that they choose to watch, brings them trust, and that they find quality in that content. So they believe, Latinos believe, they're choosing content that is meaningful and has quality. Interestingly, in this chart, though, and you're not going to see it come up on here, but it's in the report a little bit deeper in the narrative, that 72% of Hispanics say that social media doesn't factor into their content selection process. I think that's interesting, because if you asked off the cuff, do you think social media influences what people watch? I think many people would say yes, of course. That's not true for the Latino community. In fact, as I said, nearly 3/4 saying no, it is largely what my friends and family are recommending that I consume. Oh, that's really interesting. So where are Hispanics saying that where are Hispanic audiences finding content that is most relevant for them, or where do they believe that content sits? The vast majority saying it sits within streaming. So this 51%, while it's the same as the percent is the same, the question and the response here is different, is without saying this chart, we haven't looked and said, where is the most representation? We've simply asked Latinos, where do you believe there is most representation, which would influence a choice, right? You're going to go to where you feel there's most or the best representation in content. 51% saying absolutely streaming, and then everyone else sort of just whatever, 16% say broadcast, 60% say cable, which is essentially more people saying no. So really, Latinos saying, when I want to watch relevant content, I go straight to streaming. Now, part of that can be a function, again, of access to technology, fluidity of technology, but very interesting that that's the belief of where the best representation is. Now let's look at this is another belief of where they believe representation is within those platforms. Then we'll talk about what it actually looks like, because Nielsen has the data to look at that. What genres do you find most representative? Well, Latinos find drama, feature films, comedy, and documentaries sort of the most representative. We are able to deconstruct attributes of content within each of these to understand what is it about drama, or what types of dramas do you find most representative? What types of documentaries? And I'm sad to inform to you that generally speaking, those attributes are what we would consider perhaps negative attributes of content, meaning that even though Latinos are saying, I find Latinos most present in these genres, these are the genres that tend to have not the most positive portrayals of Latinos. So we are seeing ourselves presented in content around themes that are challenging themes. That doesn't mean those themes should go away and all content should be positive. There's always going to be, narcos and crime dramas that are incredibly interesting that we all love. But it is disproportionate today, but that when Latinos are presented within any given genre, that the attributes of those genres are disproportionate to negative attributes, if that makes sense. And of note, for when it comes to least, which is yellow, 34% say that they are find information or news the least, have the least representation of Latinos. This is important because information and news genres are the genres that have the power to inform us. The power to be the authority on a topic. And if that's where we're seeing less representation, that removes us from that narrative of importance. Let's get to that representation slide. Hang on, it's coming. Here we are. And I'll gonna tap back because I do want to talk about news, and then Adam, I'll probably pause unless there's time, and we'll take some questions. So here's what representation looks like today. This is what we call share of screen, which is of top content on television, broadcast, and cable. Now there's a couple of nuances here, so stay with me. For total television, Latino representation is 13.5%. That's overall. Now that includes whatever you see here in yellow. So you have broadcast at 22%. Hold on for a second on that. Cable 49 and streaming at 8. So you say, well, 13% isn't bad. The population is, as we discussed, around 20%. It's 19%. Broadcast here, though, this 22% represents Spanish language television. And of course, on Spanish language television, you're going to have excellent representation of Latinos. When you remove Spanish language television from broadcast, it drops to just 6%, if you can see this here. So really, Spanish language television is lifting up the entirety of all of broadcast television, and that's just a few networks. Where it really would be if you remove Spanish language, again, is around 6%, leaving total TV not at 13.5, but at 6% representation for Hispanics. And it looks worse when you deconstruct that into Latinas versus Latinos, Afro-Latinos, et cetera. Very, very low representation. So again, streaming coming in at 8.5%. That's higher than total television. It's higher than broadcast television. It's higher than cable. And so when we look at why Latinos are choosing to go to streaming, it doesn't mean that all of the choices available there are the absolute best. They are just the best of what's available. Which helps us understand, again, that earlier slide where I talked about streaming. And I'm sorry, where I talked about YouTube and why we see Latinos are consuming more content on YouTube. So I'm going to jump back a couple of slides now. And we want to talk a little bit about news. And then we'll kind of wrap up this conversation since we're nearly at time. Within this report, we also wanted to better understand, as a reflection of where Latinos are choosing to watch television, who they're choosing to watch, how they're influenced, how they placed trust on different mediums or different pieces of content. And what we found was that U.S. Hispanics have a very complex relationship with news. And trust in news varied by both generation and by the source. So as you can see here, you have 72% of Latinos telling us that I do not trust news on social media. I think that's a good thing, actually. I argue that's a good thing when we think back to COVID and some of the damage around information that was being passed around unchecked. This seems to me like a good vibe check that Latinos are not going to social media for their first source of news, or at least they have a relationship where there is an opportunity to fact check something further that they receive on social. Interestingly, that second 69% is local news is a reliable source. I love this one because, again, I feel like local news serves a different purpose than, of course, national or network news. And Latinos saying that they trust their local news, especially Spanish language dominant Latinos. And we know that on the ground in Spanish language television locally, again, has that accountability, factor or feature where Latinos turn to those really community partners for information about what's happening in town, how to access resources for their children, et cetera. 67% of Latinos telling us 68% that they're getting their news from online sources. And then puzzlingly, you have another 61% that just say, I don't trust most news. The challenge with this is it leaves our community open to information that is shared via other platforms, so WhatsApp or other encrypted platforms where there isn't the opportunity to do robust fact checking. We investigated this about 2 years ago in one of our Hispanic Diverse Intelligence Series reports, and found that one of the detriments of encrypted technology for messaging is that there's no opportunity to really fact check, and that was sort of rampant sharing of mis and disinformation really in 2021 post-COVID that definitely hurt our community. So it's interesting to me here that there are people are still shying away from actual news sources and wanting to rely on perhaps news that is shared by family and friends. And then about 48%, that very last one, telling us that they get most of their news from TV programming. And then again, I want to sort of juxtapose that 72% that say I don't trust news on social media with that second to the last one that says I get most of my news through social media. So you have 50% saying I get my news through social, and then you have 73% saying, but I don't trust it. So really interesting, and a lot of opportunity here as we're working with other news providers, and we're working with companies that are thinking about how we ensure that mis and disinformation isn't being transmitted for the Latino community. It sounds like the markers are all there for more scrutiny around news, and that was one of the positive things that we saw. And then here again, it's a little more of a deep dive into news and the different perceptions Latinos have. Again, I said based on generation or based on country of origin. As you can imagine, the country that Latinos were born in or immigrated from has an influence on whether or not they have a trust for the news, which is often a proxy in some of these countries for government. I'm not going to go through all of these, but what is interesting is that country of origin did in fact have an influence, as you would imagine it would. Let's see. We talked about representation declining on television. I shared where it's at today with about 6% overall. And this is actually back to sentiment. So the representation present in content is something that we are able to evaluate and operationalize for content. This is a perception here where we ask Latinos, do you think representation has declined? And as I suggested earlier, Latinos did tell us, yes, I do believe that it has declined. And we're thinking again about authentic representation versus just someone on screen who is necessarily Latino. So the biggest challenge out there today is that there is so much content to watch, but really nothing is on. And I'm sure you hope that may resonate for you. 30% of Latinos telling us that they have trouble finding something to watch on television, yet we have more than 1 million unique titles on television, and a significant portion of those in language or subtitled or captioned. And part of that is the way Latinos, again, are seeing themselves reflected in media. You know, you have this many titles, you have this many that have authentic representation, you have this many that you're able, if your choice is going to watch content in streaming and perhaps you have a language choice, it just limits it down and down. Generation Z is telling us that more than any other group, that their values are largely shared and reflected in popular TV. Think again about where Gen Z is consuming their content, though. They are going out and they are seeking and finding very specific content through streaming channels or otherwise that speaks to them generationally, in culture, with a more complex understanding of identity. And so they're like, yeah, 56% are like, TV is getting better at reflecting, my community in popular culture. And the same thing with millennials. But you see that declining with older generations, and I'm sure you can already guess why, is older generations tend to be more tied to traditional broadcast or cable, where there is a lot less inclusivity. Recall that chart I showed you where even though streaming was only at 8.5%, it was the highest of any group when you removed Spanish language television. And so streaming now, however imperfect it is, does reign king for Latinos being able to find relevant and meaningful content. And when you have less access to streaming content, your experience with television is less inclusive. So the overview, this is kind of the last slide. This is an overview of the different themes within the report. I cannot go through all of them I'm sorry. This is an overview of the themes in the report. We didn't go through all of them in this presentation because it would simply have taken us too long, but we do explore trust in media from a personal relationship, how Latinos are feeling about media, how they're feeling about brands that are within inclusive content, and whether or not inclusive programming is connecting with Latinos better. And then, of course, as we discussed, the relationship with news, which is very complicated, and I think will become more in the spotlight over the course of the next year. We have an election, as everyone knows, coming. And so trust in media and the environments in which brands place themselves are increasingly important. We explore the media consumption behaviors and connectivity trends, consumption behaviors related to culture and people's experience with different technologies and how savvy they are. And then, of course, how that influences their consumption, just as we just discussed with older generations, perhaps having a different experience with media as a result of their technological relationship with devices and platforms. Cultural resonance and comprehension. This is really cool within the report. We dive really deep into the experience Latinos have with brands that show up authentically, what that looks like, being present within the community and the community narrative in a meaningful way. Again, ways that I think you can explore within your walls of how you show up meaningfully and present within a community outside really of just the walls, how you're represented within the community. And then, of course, we also talk about that in more detail, and then brand presence. So how important it is for brands and advertisers to be in the right spot. This report is designed to be a resource to a number of community groups, or a number, I should say, of stakeholders. So we have, of course, a brand and advertiser narrative. There is an academic narrative, and then, of course, for advocacy groups or organizations who are trying to advance either their cause with Latinos or the Latino cause. So each of these sort of hit on different points, and I think there are components that you can take from throughout the report to make it more meaningful for you and your work. So I'm going to go back to that first slide. If you have more interest in it, please make sure you snap the QR code there. and grab the whole report to yourself. If there are any specific questions you have on any section, I'd be happy to take them now, or feel free to message me on one of the platforms and I can give you more detail on any of those topics that we discussed.
This was just fantastic. Great stuff. So we have time for a few questions. Let's put them in there. Please put your question in the chat or raise your emoji hand. And I guess, Stacie, while we're waiting for that to happen, I wonder if you could talk about, since this is out there, how can we expect, or how is Nielsen starting to kind of imagine what the shift in representation in terms of media entities are going to take with this information? You know, we're going to see some negative drawback from the writer's strike, but what should we anticipate seeing? Greater representation, greater numbers? I wonder if you can just talk about the changes. And while you're doing that, we have some questions that will come in. Melinda,
sure. I think we're going to expect to see a continuous evolution of representation. There were some tough elements this year. For example, our, Blue Beetle coming out right around the time when not being allowed to promote the film, et cetera. And then perhaps some of the success of the film being impacted, not as a result of the film or the fact that it's Latino characters or, but the fact that it was during a tumultuous time for the industry. So I think what we might see is a little bit of pullback in the short term. And then, as the community continues to evolve and grow and move their eyeballs and their 61 billion minutes of viewing a week toward other content, it is going to become present. It's going to become obvious to media companies and those that greenlight and produce content that they need to be more authentically inclusive. I think the big question is, what does that mean? That's kind of thrown around all the time. People are like, authenticity, authentically inclusive. What does that really mean? Is it an entire storyline that is, a narrative around the experience? Is it nods? I think that has yet to evolve. Part of the challenge is the industry today is very, as much as they try and break the mold, things are very formulaic. And if you think of the work that has done really, really, really well, it's all work that's really, really, really different. And it is in taking those risks. It's interesting, we see those risks being taken with other type of content that is outside of the Latino community. So, you can think of, I'm sure, a couple of examples where you're like, that was amazing, but it was super different, right? Insecure, whatever. Like that's such a different type of show. And Issa Rae did that her way, right? And that's, of course, was remarkable for the Black community, for sisterhood. But there are very few shows like that do things so different and then have such success that there's willingness to replicate it. So we keep doing things the way we've done it. But as we discussed, you have this much younger population who are coming into their power from that arc, coming into their financial independence, aging into what will be, and I don't even want to say arguably, because it's not going to be arguably, like the most powerful cohort this country has ever seen over the next 15 years. I didn't even talk about homeownership stats, any of that, because that's not what we were discussing today. But as this cohort advances and becomes more powerful, I think we will see some of those walls crumble and more of content developed and designed for this evolving demographic that doesn't look like all the demographics before it, for which media, entertainment, advertising have all been designed. It's almost like breaking that and rebuilding it. And that presents a challenge for America. We're not good at that.
Well, there's a 3.4%, $3.4 trillion purchasing power. So Melinda, we're going to go over, but let's ask your question and we'll hear your answer and then we'll say our thank yous. Melinda.
Sure. Hi, Stacie.
Hi, how are you? It's good to see you again.
Yes, well, I'm off camera, but we'll check in later.
Sure.
But so thank you for all this information. Adam and I are colleagues and certainly working on a large museum audience engagement project in how we can better reach and grow our Latino millennial audiences. So based on this report, I'm thinking we should be on YouTube more. Is that something you can give us some insight too. We're certainly trying to enhance our video capabilities.
Absolutely. I'm more than willing to share some specific details for you. You know how to reach me. I know
Yes.
we didn't run into each other in New York last week, although I think we wanted to. But yes, please let me know what you're thinking or how I can provide additional resources to support your initiatives. I'm happy to do so.
Great.
And to help direct you around, what makes the most sense for you too.
Thanks. I'm sure Adam and I will put our heads together along with some other colleagues working on that project.
Great.
Also was just
Yeah.
quickly interested, Disney
Mhm.
seemed low to me compared to YouTube and others, given how young the Latino population is. Any insight on Disney versus Netflix?
Sure. Well, Netflix has and you're talking about this chart here. This again is for all Hispanics. I think if we took a look at this for maybe Spanish language dominant Hispanics or Hispanics within a specific demographic, you would see that a little bit different. You would see Disney perhaps pop a little bit more, or even Hulu. Netflix is very hard to compete with. It is just sort of at the top. But remember, a lot of the content, with the exception of Disney, is being rewatched on YouTube. It's not just individual creator videos, it's also old content. So, older sort of nostalgic content that's being consumed by older generation. So what we could do is perhaps look at this in a specific demographic. So if you're interested, for example, in 18 to 35 or 18 to 34, we can take a look at that distribution and see how much that changes. When you look at Latinos with children, Latino families and households, you see that those Disney numbers go a lot higher. This is an overview. And with a younger demographic, yes, more likely to be in childbearing years, but not everyone has born those children yet.
This has been great. I want to thank you again for this wonderful presentation. Information is wonderful. It's really been helpful. And I love that you took the full time, because there was a lot of data. I think we're going to have you for a part 2. I know that my colleagues would certainly join you. We did put the link in the chat, so do check out the full report on this and the other great content that Nielsen has. And we will work to schedule more Nielsen programs in the future. Stacie, again, and your colleagues at Nielsen for being so supportive of this staff learning series. Again, I hope you have a great day. And colleagues, this will be up on Prism soon. So please.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.